So how's this for a question? This week I was asked about polygamy in the Bible. So dudes that had lots of wives, like Solomon had hundreds and hundreds of wives, right? So I want to be straight up right out of the gate what I believe. I believe it is crystal clear in the Bible that monogamy, marriage between one man and one woman, is the standard of the Bible from the beginning of the Bible and then reinforced obviously in the New Testament by Jesus himself and New Testament writers. So if you want to, you can go look at Matthew 19, verses 3-9. Essentially, the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus and be like, well, it says in the law in the Old Testament that if you're upset with your wife or you don't like her, there's different things you can do. But you can actually write a certificate of divorce and then you can leave her and break up with her. And Jesus says, I know it says that, but I say to you, right? And the reason he says that, he says, because your hearts were hard. And then what does he do? He reverts back to Genesis, to the beginning of creation, and he says, a man will leave his mother and father, and same with the woman, and the two will come together, and they will become one flesh. And what God has brought together, let no man separate. And everything described in Genesis and in Matthew 19, Jesus is using, and the Old Testament writers are using things in the singular. There's nothing in the plural in the grammatics and in the language that would suggest it's ever between more than one man or more than one woman. So it's in the singular. So the ideal, right? God's design is for one man and one woman to get married and for them to not be separated no matter what. And the only circumstance Jesus gives them an out for is that one of them would be unfaithful to the other, right? So think about that. That precedent, what Jesus is saying is that the law, although it was explaining certain scenarios that God would allow certain things to happen, that wasn't necessarily God's ideal standard. And so just because it was allowed doesn't mean that it was God's preference. And so we see that all throughout the Old Testament. Just because there's description of things that are happening doesn't mean that that's prescription. And just because we have Exodus 21:10 and Deuteronomy 21:15 that talks about instructions for those that might have multiple wives, that doesn't mean that that was God's standard and that he was putting his stamp of approval and saying it was okay. And we know that because Jesus comes and says, look, yes, I know the law says this, but that's because your hearts were hard. And he's reverting back to the way things were in perfection in the garden and the way God had originally designed them. So the other question to ask in this is, how many of those situations in the Old Testament where a dude had multiple wives actually worked out really well? I'm waiting. Let me know. Solomon, the wisest man to ever live besides Jesus himself, had the most wives recorded in the Old Testament. And it was actually his wives who led him away from God's heart. So think about it. The wisest man that ever lived was led astray by multiple women and women from other countries. It was out of disobedience that he married women from different places. And that was the thing that really caused him the most problems. Okay? David, his infidelity, and what he did with Bathsheba and having multiple women, look at the drama in his life. It's drama, drama, drama. So remember, just because the Bible describes something, right? That's description. It's describing something. That doesn't mean that the Bible's prescribing that as truth and that we should be a part of that. So just because we see people doing things in the Old Testament doesn't mean we need to go out and hook up with a bunch of wives. So that's a really, a good way to look at it. The last thing I'll tell you is this idea of the culture back then and why I believe God probably allowed it. Why I believe in the Old Testament, he didn't really point it out and make men like David repent for doing that. He didn't explicitly reprimand David or reprimand Solomon. He showed the outcome of it and he showed the depravity that came from it. He showed the fruit of it. But ultimately, I think one of the main reasons that God allowed it for a season, and there's evidence of that he allowed it because he's ultimately sovereign, and also there's some biblical evidence that he allowed that to take place, is because women back then that did not have a husband, right, were astronomically more likely to end up abused in slavery and prostitution or in utter poverty and starvation. So the destitute nature of being a single woman back then, I believe in God's divine mercy in those harsh times, he allowed that to take place where a woman could enter into the covering of a man and his provision. even if he already had multiple wives. So I think that is the reason why. I think that was out of God's grace and out of his mercy for those women. But ultimately, all along, his design has been and always will be marriage between one man and one woman. And if he ever allowed anything other than that, or even divorce in the first place, I believe that that is just because of our hardness of heart and also because of the fall of man due to sin. The last thing I'll leave you with is the qualifications in the New Testament to become a deacon and an elder. This further supports what I'm talking about and what Jesus talked about, that the qualification for a deacon and an elder is that they'd be married to one woman. And so these are our examples of what followers of Jesus should look like, deacons and elders. These are the servants of the church, and elders are the leaders of the church. And so I think it's really, really clear. If you have any questions, if that doesn't answer all of it, man, let me know. I'm happy to pop some Bible references your way. But I hope that helps. Long story short, don't run out there and get hitched to multiple people. Thank you.